Hey, it's great to be with you, and I'm not very good at anniversaries and birthdays, and it seems like you fall on one side of that line. Either your 40th birthday was a really big deal to you, or it was just another day, and I would be among the just another day thing. And so far, my wife has been willing to be married to me for 19 years, but even my anniversary celebrations are fairly lame. 3 kids, lots of birthdays, and again, not very good at that. But I say all that to say the lead up to this morning and really to this weekend, and not just so much the weekend, but to the significance of starting our 11th year, which I'm thinking of the first week as our first year, or first week of the 11th year, however you want to think about that. It caught me off guard, and that was months ago, really, that it started to catch me off guard, and I didn't entirely understand why that was and what was going on. But actually, frankly, through working through all this with a spiritual director and having lots of conversations with my wife and friends, there's a few things that I could put my finger on. One of them was this realization that when you're given $250,000 to go plant a church and you take lives like those, I mean, it's pretty humbling when you look at, here's these 20-something, kids. We were all kids, and they had parents in town, and we were affecting grandkids and futures and all kinds of things. One of the things that came with my commissioning was this, what I knew was this responsibility to teach the Bible. And I took that very seriously. I was very honored by that. I was grateful for Andy Stanley, who, as we got closer to launching, kind of helped me to understand that my job isn't to teach the Bible, but my job is to help us live and to follow Jesus as a way of living. And I think that's an important distinction. But still, one of the parting comments I remember hearing from one of my mentors, and Vern, who Harvest was one of the churches that planted this thing, is I can't even put myself in the where it was said thing, which I suppose should warn us all about the words that we say and how they do stick, don't they? But he said, Adam, you're a biblicist. And we were in a group of people, I think it might have even been an annual conference, and he said, you're a biblicist, right, Adam? And he meant that as a compliment, and it was a compliment. A biblicist is this kind of technical language for somebody who, you're committed to the text. It's this, like, the Bible says it, that settles it kind of vibe. And I knew that. But for me, the tension of all of this and the run-up to all this that I guess made it difficult was this realization of I am, as many of you are, committed to following Jesus and the life that comes with that as we learn it from the text. But nobody prepared me for the fact that can be true, and it is true, and yet simultaneously there can be this need to look in the mirror and go, but I believe differently than I did 10 years ago. I thought, and maybe this is where you're at, and that's why I wanted to use, to me, the occasion of this is the perfect time to ask the big question about evolving faith. Because I don't think anybody told me this. I don't think I was told that I had to believe this, but somehow what I internalized was that if you're doing faith accurately, if you're doing it with integrity, if you're doing it well, if you're a biblicist, then you spend X number of years developing a faith, and then you mark the accomplishment of that faith through big things like baptism and serving at church and beginning to give. There's these different ways that different people mark that, like, you've arrived. But for me, what's been helpful to name is this realization that I think there's also this sense where you go, okay, I've got it, and now my job is to spend the rest of my life defending this position that I've arrived at and demonstrating that I'm faithful, that I'm one of the persevering saints, as the New Testament calls it, that I'm going to finish well, as one of my mentors calls it. I'm going to do that by demonstrating that I can live the next 50 years of my life and be unwavering in what I believe. And for me, part of the process, and it was a process by which I shared some of this with the council and with mentors like Delamarter and Bruner and Fred and with my wife and with some friends and the staff, there came this point where I just had to acknowledge, like, I'm in for another 10 years, but first I've got to acknowledge to myself that I'm in to the degree that it's okay, that what I believe today is different. And I'm not talking about the big stuff. I was in a conversation this week with somebody out of state, and they said, Adam, what's the big stuff for you? And I go, there's just one for me. It's the resurrection. I'm not going to waver on that one. But I can disagree on lots of other things. And so I guess here's the question that I really want to get out there, and that's why I just, at the risk of making all this all about me, it's really not. What I want to do is curate a conversation and maybe even create some introspection and some journaling and some spiritual direction and some therapy and some small group and however it is you process God and life and relationship to begin to get you to say out loud what I'm just convinced is inevitable, and that is this question: what if faith evolves? And is that okay? And is there precedent for that? And can we, on the one hand, admit that's not always good, but on the other hand, admit that's inevitable? And is there a way to be faithful to Christ and faithful to the gospel, while at the same time acknowledging, listen, I'm not where I was, fill in the blank. Part of my motivation for this series is that for many of you, the person you walked down the aisle with 5 or 10 or 30 years ago isn't here, and it's not because you're not married, it's because you fundamentally believe differently now. And there's a tension there. And I guess part of what motivates me in this series is what happens if we get that stuff on the table? And could, speaking of death by self-talk, could we remove some of the spiritual shame that comes with you sitting in a room with these respected people, these people who mentored and these people you love, these people who, quite frankly, you respect their faith and their character more than your own, and yet you can't help but know that when you sit in the room with them and certain things come up, you just have this sense of like, I don't buy into that anymore. I'm not there anymore. And it's not that I don't follow Jesus, but I'm not there. And for me, part of what motivates me in this series is a community full of people who I don't think whether or not they believe or are following Jesus or trust that the tomb was empty is really what's at stake. It's this sense of there's like skeletons everywhere, and when they get to a place like this, that they feel like they're playing a game because they feel like they're the only one that doesn't think what they think. I had this experience last week. There's one of my like daily leads of the dreams thing is I try to listen to a podcast every day because I'm a professional plagiarist, and so content in, content out is an important part of the equation. But there's one stream that I listen to, and I don't like listening to it. I don't know if you have any of those, but I listen to it because I have this sense like it keeps me anchored to certain kind of Western evangelical, frankly, values that I still want to be challenged by, but I don't always connect to anymore. So I listen to this because I think he's one of the best, and he has some of the best interviews, and it's always an act of discipline to listen. But in this case, there was an interview that he was doing with another person who I know who's a church leader in another part of the country. And again, the type of guy that I just go like, I genuinely respect where he's at more than myself. And so I downloaded this podcast. I was at the gym. I downloaded it because it was about evangelism, and I knew that was going to be uncomfortable. And again, and we all know it's healthy to listen to things and read things that you disagree with. Maybe that's why you're here this morning. Just don't tell me. It's okay if we disagree. I just prefer not to know. Kind of. So I was listening to this deal, and I'm 5 minutes in, and here's what the conversation kind of sounds like. How many people in your church have shared the gospel in the last week? And then it evolved to, and how many people in your church have shared the gospel in the last year? And then this person who's being interviewed, again, who I have genuine respect for, and it's that kind of like scary, like, I disagree, but I don't know if I should. He starts talking about how he has this personal principle where anytime he uses Uber, whether it's a 2-minute Uber ride or a 20-minute Uber ride, one of his commitments to God is that he, quote unquote, shares the gospel with the Uber driver before he gets dropped off. And I was listening to this, and again, I try to finish him because I feel like if I start a podcast, it's almost always a good thing if I finish it. There's always something in there. The disruptions are good things, and I couldn't do it. Because I was listening to this, and on the one hand going, I absolutely believe that when people meet Jesus, the future is different for them and a whole tree of people, not to mention a community. I fundamentally believe Jesus came to win converts, if that's what you want to call it. And yet personally, I'm just like, I'm just not there. And frankly, I don't believe that the gospel should be amounted to the minimal entrance requirements for heaven. I'm not convinced that's what it is. And it brings up this question, go ahead to that next slide, of what do you do when you no longer believe what you're supposed to believe? And again, if this is too disruptive, I'm sorry, there's a lot of great churches in town. But what I think we have to begin to admit, and I guess what I'm hoping is an honest part of being a church that's entering into its 11th/1st year, is this admission that we're celebrating 10 years of history, and yet individually and collectively, things change. And is that okay? And is there a way to acknowledge that just because they change doesn't mean you're right? But the opposite can also be true, can't it? Just because it's changed doesn't mean you're wrong. And how do people of faith, how do we handle this with integrity? Nobody needs me to say that civil discourse is something that's missing. And what happens if a community of people can begin to be more honest about this realization? And so here's the question I want to ask this morning. We're really going to spend a couple weeks on this. If you only come to Narrate one more time for the rest of your life, please make sure that it's next week, because next week, Dr. Stephen Delamarter, who is a renowned scholar and a friend and a former prophet, George Fox, is going to be here, and we're going to give him an abnormal amount of time because he wants to unpack this from the New Testament. But here's the one way that I want to ask it this morning, is there any kind of theme from this? I love the way the Bible Project says that the Bible is a unified story leading us to Jesus. Is there any kind of theme that would suggest you're not as weird and you're not as heretical and you're not as out to lunch as you might think? You know, the late Bronze Age is where we place Abraham, and that's somewhere around 12,000 BCE. So we've got, call it 3,200 years of history of people identifying with Yahweh. Is there anything about their story that speaks to ours? And one way to look at this would be to talk about early Israelite to later Israelite faith. And again, early Israelite, we're talking late Bronze Age. Later Israelite, we're talking David and Solomon, kind of leading us closer to the temple and many of those things. Exodus 15. Watch this. And I guess here's the question, because what I want to try to demonstrate, and obviously I have an agenda here, but what I want to try to demonstrate is watch how a person's and a people's faith, their understanding of God, changes over time. And does that mean that God changes, or does that mean that God meets us in the dirt and the grime and the imperfection of our understandings of him and our theologies? I love that. Is it C.S. Lewis who said theology works until you try to write it down? But that this God is in it with us, in its imperfections, and committed to moving it forward. So watch Exodus 15. This is Miriam, which scholars would say this song that was sung after the Exodus is among the oldest words in the entire Bible. Verse 11, who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? Anything there that's a little uncomfortable? Anything there that you're like, wait a minute? Anything there that suddenly you go like, well, I think I can explain it, but I've got to do all kinds of gymnastics that I was trained to do. Chapter 18, and then we'll kind of dig into this. This is now Jethro, not the Sandoz dog, but Moses' father-in-law. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who treated Israel arrogantly. Speaking again of the Exodus. Anything there that you're like, awkward. Question. Were the early Israelites, was Abraham a person who was monotheistic? Did he believe that there was one God and that was that and that's settled? Or is it more integrous to say, no, he was, the word scholars uses the word monolatry. Like, was Abraham a monotheist, or did he practice monolatry? And monolatry is distinct in this way. Monolatry says there are several gods and one distinct God, Yahweh, that's worthy of our worship and following. Now, am I suggesting that Jesus wasn't monotheist? I'm actually not. I think he was. Am I suggesting that Second Temple Judaism and the Jews in Jesus' day didn't practice monotheism? I'm actually not. But do you see that, well, wait a minute, what if? What if in the early going, these people are far more accurately described as monolaters, I don't even know what tense you use for that word, than they are monotheists? And just as a reminder to kind of go like, we're not suggesting this is pervasive, just that it's early and it's there, because it changes in later Judaism. Listen to Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 2. So here we have this prophet speaking hundreds of years after the Exodus. And listen to Jeremiah. This is what the Lord says. So he's claiming to represent God. What fault did your ancestors find in me that they strayed so far from me? They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. So before you go like, well, Adam says that the Jews weren't monotheists, that's actually not what I'm saying. But what if this God works with our cultural conditions and our imperfections, and what we see in the text is a story that's not that much different than yours, a refining of. We could talk about Nahum and Jonah. These are both minor prophets. They played guard on the basketball team. And Nahum's a couple hundred years before Jonah. Jonah's somewhere in the 400s, Nahum's 7 or 600s. Look at this text from Nahum. The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. Remember that word, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy the images and the idols that are in the temple of your gods. I will prepare your grave, for you are vile. So should you be sitting, at work and someone said, hey, what sense do you make of Nahum? Well, wouldn't the most honest sense be that these people understood that the Ninevites were scum and that God wasn't all that interested in them, that he was interested in his own? Fast forward a couple hundred years and you have Jonah. And Jonah, the story you may have some familiarity with because it involves a guy getting swallowed by a fish and eating sushi and getting skipped up on the beach. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. But ultimately, remember, Jonah, the reason he got thrown into the ocean was because God sent him to the same city, to Nineveh. And yet God's message that he wanted Jonah to deliver wasn't, you're all a bunch of scumbags. It was what? If you'll just trust Yahweh, if you'll turn from your idols and trust Yahweh, I'm more merciful than I am just, God is saying. And Jonah's issue was, God, I know who you are, and you'll forgive them, and I don't like it. So again, early to later Israelite faith, what do we see? We see these people who seem to be coming from a very tribal understanding and a very local deity understanding to gaining a greater grasp of this God who says, no, you got to understand, I love people. I want all people, which seems to culminate when Jesus says in his parting words, hey, go to all nations and talk to them about me. What if faith evolves? We could talk about later Israelite to post-exilic Israelite. And by post-exilic, I know we're getting a little in the brain, but maybe it's me subconsciously avoiding the emotion. But post-exilic refers to Israel after the temple was destroyed. 586 BC, the Babylonians destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Most people were killed. Those who survived weren't allowed to exist in Israel, but were carried off into the kingdom. Ever wondered... Go ahead to that next slide. Ever wondered, when are they Israelites and when are they Jews? Ever wondered that question? I've found myself awkwardly feeling like a hick from Montana, not knowing which is right on many occasions. I asked a professor, my professor Jason Price, about this just a couple weeks ago, and I said, okay, so what's the difference? How do we understand which is which? And he said, well, actually, it's very complicated, which, of course, everything in scholarship is, but the simple version is this. Israelite refers to the Jewish people pre-586. Because their way of relating to God and understanding God and connecting with God was what? Well, you went to the temple and there was this ritual and you knew that the priests were offering sacrifices every day, and there was these occasions where you migrated to the temple and you took the first bits of your grain. It was all what the technical word is cultic. It was all centered around this actual, literal Near Eastern temple. After the temple was destroyed, you have people in places like Babylon. And a big part of the Old Testament, this is the story they're telling, is they're answering this question, what does it mean to follow Yahweh now? We don't have a temple. We can't give sacrifices. How do we deal with our sin? How do we deal with our stuff? And what happened was they became the people of the book. Synagogue, Abraham's never been to synagogue. It was invented after the temple was destroyed because these people were left going, how do we stay true? The Hebrew scriptures saved Israel. They took these stories that they had in place, some of them written, many of them oral, and they began to collect them and compile them and form scrolls within them. And they became a people who centered their faith around a book, so to speak. But do you see the point there? If you were to grab Moses and ask him to experience, say, the Italian prophet Malachi's faith experience after the temple was destroyed, Moses would have felt as out of place and foreign as you would probably if we took you to an Eastern Orthodox service tomorrow. Two groups of people from the same lineage, wrestling with who is this God. It changes. Or you could think of it this way. How many of you have a Nokia cell phone in your pocket? That's a stupid question. And some of you are like, Nokia? My very first cell phone in 1997 was a Nokia, and it was the hottest, sexiest phone. You could get red or blue or black or yellow. And it had this antenna. Many of you guys remember this? It had a collapsible antenna. It was like the hottest thing. Like this antenna didn't just stay. You could like pull it up. I don't even think you could text from the thing yet. Where's Nokia? Well, the answer is actually relatively known. Nokia was an industry leader. They had a very strong research and development department. There was a point in their expertise and in their thriving where the research and development department came to their board of directors and said, hey, we got to show you this thing that we've been working on. Guess what the thing was? It was a touch screen phone. They said, we think the next wave of phones is going to involve touch screens. And the executive said, nobody's ever going to want a touchscreen phone. And so they parked it in research and development. And Nokia today is obviously, they're not gone. They're a subsidiary of Microsoft, but they're gone. The relevance, gone. Or how about this? How come we've heard of Taco Bell, but many of our kids haven't even been alive when there's been a Blockbuster? Some of you have forgotten all about this, but let me remind you of your credit card statements, because it used to be that when you were going to rent a movie, I remember as a kid, like there was no streaming. In fact, VCRs were so stinking expensive that it was a special occasion when you were going to go to the store, and you weren't just going to rent a movie, you were also going to rent a VCR. Remember that? And then years later, there were these stores, and if you wanted to watch a movie, you'd walk the aisles, and theoretically, they had all kinds of different versions of the latest release, but ultimately, you ended up watching Herbie because there was nothing ever available. And then you got home, and you spent your $3.99, and then the next day, you carried it out to your car, and then it fell off the passenger seat, and it went underneath the passenger seat, and 2 weeks later, you got your credit card statement, and you're like, why is there this $5,700 charge from Blockbuster? And then you were reminded, like, oh yeah, we forgot to return that movie. And then Netflix came along, and Netflix changed the game. They said before there was any streaming, they said, we don't have to build a warehouse in every town. We'll just build a few across the country, and then we'll sell monthly subscriptions, a flat rate, and people can pay based upon the number of DVDs they want at a time. And if they just choose to keep, planet Earth for the rest of their lives, that's okay. As long as they keep paying their monthly fee, they can hold on to that without any late charges. And there was a point at which Blockbuster had a conversation about Netflix. And the conversation was, do we need to adapt? And the conclusion, I'm assuming after very intelligent people having lots of meetings, the conclusion was, well, 25% of our revenue comes from late fees, so we're going to stay the course. Now, could this potentially be manipulative to take Blockbuster and parallel that with the scriptures? I think you ultimately have to decide. But what if it illustrates this very simple thing, that what we see in the scriptural narrative is a road with cliffs on both sides. On one side of the cliff, we have people who refused to allow new culture and new understandings of God to influence their connections to God. And they didn't make it. And their story's not represented in the text. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. And on the other side of the cliff, you've got people who were hyper-progressive. They got too far out there. And their story isn't in there either. But what a guy like Dr. Dellemarter will tell you is that the stories represented here are these people who understood that part of the responsibility that comes with following God is an understanding, a humility to your theology that goes, man, this is what's making sense right now, and this is where I'm at. And yet this recognition that it's all culturally conditioned and there's lots of things we can't know for sure, and probably 20 years from now, if you're still alive, you'll think about that a little bit differently. There's post-exilic. We could talk post-exilic Judaism to Second Temple Judaism. And again, we're talking after the temple was destroyed. Second Temple Judaism that refers to the temple Herod built for the Jews, how nice of him, that was ultimately destroyed in AD 70. And one of the things that happened in this era that kind of captures this is Greek Hellenization. Alexander the Great, you may have heard of him. He had a whole new approach to conquering the ancient Near East. It involved imparting this Greek culture to these cities and changing city names, and citizenship became a part of the deal, and worshiping the Greek gods became a part of the deal. And it was a pervasive thing. And for the Jewish people, it was a very threatening thing. The Greeks wanted to bring gymnasiums to Israel. And oh, by the way, the Greeks exercise buck naked. And that was offensive to these people. And then they started to recognize, like, wait a minute, our kids, like, they don't talk anymore. They just use Snapchat. And they began to recognize, like, wait a minute, people aren't reading Hebrew anymore. They're reading Greek. And there was this conversation of, like, how do we help people continue to value the scriptures and access them because they're not teaching Hebrew in school anymore, so to speak. And some people were going, no, you can't translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek because God spoke to Solomon in Hebrew. And if you translate it to Greek, then you're losing the word of God. And other people went, no, we have to. And that's where what is technically called the Septuagint comes from. It was an adaptation. It was an evolution. It was a people that went, wait a minute, we think it's the same God if we're reading it in Greek, not Hebrew. You know, we could talk Second Temple Judaism to first century followers of Jesus. And again, this is the, like, don't miss Dr. Dellermarter, because his wife's a genetic scientist, so he's going to nerd out from the scriptures, and then we're going to, like, take a breath, and then he's going to nerd out from science, and it'll be lots of fun. But here's kind of his big idea as best I can tell. First century, what do we have? First third, Jesus doing his thing, walking out of the tomb alive. Second third of the first century, what do you have? You've got the book of Acts and Paul and the early church blowing up. A whole new understanding of God. Third of the first century, what do you have? You've got the early church and the early church fathers beginning to ask this question of, okay, in light of all that, what does it mean to be faithful to the gospel today? And involve these really messy conversations like, wait a minute, a dude with crushed testicles can't follow God? Nah, we're going to get rid of that one. Wait a minute, you can't eat shrimp? Nah, eat them cold. And it's easy for us to just blow right by them, but all the same, what you have is a people doing the exhausting, vulnerable work of going, wait a minute. What if God is sharpening our understanding? We live in this age where we get to celebrate, you know, the Word becoming flesh, all the fullness of God dwelling in Christ. But I guess the question is, does that mean that it's just done? It's all figured out? Or does following God come with this incredible responsibility? I have a friend who likens it to constitutional law. Like it's this responsibility of going, what does this mean in our day? How do we do this? And is there a way to acknowledge that faith evolves and yet still not even necessarily agree on the implications of that? And is that okay? And can there be a community who does life and faith together, who disagree on some important things, but agree on the premise that faith evolves over time? Here's what was helpful to me, and if this is helpful to you, it's really all I've got for you in terms of action steps. But it was important for me. Early in the summer, one of the processes that I started, and it was one of those, it started pretty unofficially, but it became, for me, a pretty cathartic, therapeutic thing, is I opened up my Evernote in some of my chair time, and I just started writing, I believe. And if you know me and you know Narrate, you know that I really try to avoid black and white belief statements because, frankly, I'm oftentimes a coward, and I think faith gets tricky when you start calling it black and white. So originally I was writing questions, and I just felt my own subjective nudge from God, like, nope, no question marks, Adam. I believe, and start hammering it out. And for me, it was this process of just beginning to go, God, thank you for the last 10 years, and thank you for the last 20 years. But thank you that it's okay to go 20 years later, here's where I'm at. And I wonder if that might be a helpful thing for you. And here would be the good news. It doesn't have to be accurate. Because you're not writing a treatise and you're not founding a denomination. You're capturing where you're at. And what if this God is secure enough to know that where you're at isn't perfect? And then for me, what happened was there was this process where I started sharing it with my wife, with some friends. There was a point where I had to share it with the council and just go, guys, just so you know, here's where I'm at. And they're all like, looks like it's where you were 10 years ago. And I'm like, no, there's some nuances there. You know, for me, it's just by way of examples, like I believe the Bible is a gift from God. I cling to the fact that it has supernatural origins. But please, I believe it's perfect for helping us follow Jesus, but please don't ask me to sign up for like historically accurate in all of its original form. those inerrant and infallible, those extra biblical words that the last 20th century has applied to it, I'm not there. And we don't have to agree on that. Well, you get to decide whether or not we do, but that's an example. I believe Jesus is the gospel. I don't think he was coming to create 4 points or a road or 3 laws. I think he came to be the gospel and to invite us to live in the kingdom. I believe in generosity. I don't always know what to do with tithing and offering and all of the nuances of that, but what you all have taught me, if anything, is that generosity is the best way to live, and I think that takes on lots of forms. So here's my question. Would that be a helpful thing for you? In your faith journey, whatever your religious or spiritual background is, to begin to just write those down, and might that create safe conversation between you and your spouse, or you and your roommates, or you and your parents, or in some instances it might not be appropriate to share it in certain contexts. But whoever it is you're doing life with and sharing life, can you imagine what would happen to the voices in your head, to the sense of shame, if there was just this more honest sense of, here's where I'm at. And we don't have to be on the same place, but here's where I'm at. I love the way Dr. Delamarter said it. I said to him this week when we were talking, I said, that slippery slope thing, that is a really controlling idea. And he said, yeah, it is. He said, because what happens is it's dangerous. And then he said, but what happens is if we start talking about the literal nature of this, then all of a sudden there's no resurrection. And he said, sometimes we just have to slow the conversation down and go, no. We got to step onto said slope and have said conversations and trust that the people of God have faithfully been doing this for several thousand years. Dare we say millions of years. And that God is in the business of working with our imperfections and our misunderstandings and moving us toward Christ and helping a people translate what does it mean to be faithful to the gospel. Not in Great Falls, and not in Billings, and not in 2030, and not in Africa. What does it mean to be faithful to the gospel here in 2019 in Helena, Montana, to a community of people called Narrate? I'd like to pray over your process. God, thank you. Thanks, God, for a community that makes this conversation safe to even provoke. And God, Lord, on the one hand, we know that you're holy and other, and that if your actual presence was in the room, we couldn't handle it. And yet on the other hand, God, we know that you're in Christ, this approachable God who gets down and washes feet. And so God, we just want to be faithful to who you are and to the way you're represented. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.